A 10-day ultimatum for a ceasefire, and a $30 billion aid bill for Ukraine to exert pressure. Trump, who has bent on winning the Nobel Prize, has become a death warrant for both Russia and Ukraine. The conflict has lasted for more than 1,250 days. Russia's economy is on the verge of collapse, and Ukraine is preparing to form a student army to fill the front lines. Both sides are holding their last breath, waiting to see who will collapse first. While the fighting continues on the Russia-Ukraine front, Trump has already lost his patience. More than half a year after taking office, his original plan to end the war in 24 hours has become a joke. Now, he is furious because of his misplaced affection for Putin and has to use his last resort to coerce Putin back to the negotiating table. However, this move has only made Russia tougher, and the intensity of strikes against Ukraine has increased rather than decreased. Several key towns on the eastern Ukrainian battlefield have changed hands. Ukraine, although eager to fight the enemy, is hindered by its own incurable flaws. Russia, despite appearing to be advancing irresistibly, is facing inflationary pressures that make Putin quite nervous. Yet neither side is willing to make the slightest concession, vowing to fight to the end. So how will this war end? Will Ukraine collapse first because it can no longer sustain the consumption, or will Russia fall due to being unable to withstand Western sanctions? We all know that Russia and Ukraine have been fighting for more than 3 years, and both sides have paid a heavy price. The eastern region of Ukraine has been basically reduced to ruins, and all the people in the country who could flee have left. Russia is fighting abroad, and the situation at home seems calm. However, under the sanctions of the United States and the West, its oil and gas revenues have plummeted, and it has long been in a state of making ends meet. But none of this matters to Trump. His desire to make Russia and Ukraine ceasefire is not because he cares about the lives of Slavs, but just to shape the image of an international peacemaker. In his inauguration speech this year, Trump once said that peace would be his most proud legacy. Therefore, he is desperate to win the 2026 Nobel Peace Prize. After all, Obama had already won it in 2009, and Trump will never allow himself to lose to his lifelong enemy. On July 14th, Trump set a 50-day deadline for Putin to cease fire. If the fire is not stopped after the deadline, a 100% tariff will be imposed on Russian exports, and the concept of secondary sanctions was put forward for the first time, which will target third countries that continue to purchase Russian oil and gas. By July 29th, however, Trump suddenly changed his tune. He said he was extremely disappointed with Putin, accused him of deceptive diplomacy, and demanded that Putin must cease fire within 10 days, otherwise sanctions would be imposed immediately. Meanwhile, a bipartisan group newly formed by Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski and Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen in the U.S. Senate jointly proposed a bill to provide more than $50 billion in aid to Ukraine over the next 2 years. This bill is also regarded as a tool to put pressure on Putin and force him to return to the negotiating table. It is obvious that the two parties in the United States have temporarily reached a consensus and decided to step up aid to Ukraine to cope with the Russian military's summer offensive and prevent the Ukrainian army from collapsing. However, a series of actions by the United States have not stopped the Russian army. Instead, they have prompted them to accelerate their offensive pace. The Russian military announced the capture of Chasiv Yar in Donetsk. As an important logistics hub for the Ukrainian army, the fall of this city will leave multiple key areas exposed to Russian artillery fire coverage. The defense line of Krasnohorivka, a strategic stronghold in eastern Ukraine, has also been breached. While advancing steadily, the Russian army has also adopted the carousel tactics, conducting precise raids with long-range missiles and drones, and carrying out alternating fire strikes with ground artillery, armored vehicles, and glide bombs to continuously consume the effective strength of the Ukrainian army. Data from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine shows that the maximum number of daily battles reached 193 in July, and the average daily ammunition consumption of frontline troops was 1.2 times the monthly production capacity of NATO countries, which further exacerbated the defensive pressure due to ammunition shortages. Although the European Union launched a joint ammunition procurement plan, the actual delivery volume in the second quarter of 2025 was only 37% of the promised amount. Moreover, Ukraine's domestic military industry is seeing a gradual decline in production capacity due to restricted imports of raw materials. In addition, due to supply chain issues, the delivery cycle of key equipment such as Ukrainian military drones and electronic warfare devices has been extended. The weapons and equipment promised by the United States and NATO have also been delayed in implementation due to internal coordination problems. Multiple aid funds proposed by the European Union have been hindered by opposition from countries such as Hungary and disputes over the sharing ratio among member states, resulting in stalled projects. Overall, there are significant shortcomings in the supply of equipment for the Ukrainian army. Although Europe intends to provide continuous support, the withdrawal of some of its member states has made it difficult to deliver aid weapons and funds as planned. However, this is not the biggest problem. What may truly lead to a comprehensive collapse of the front line is the depletion of troops and the collapse of morale. The Zelensky government's promotion of mandatory conscription has led to a sharp decline in the quality of soldiers. According to reports, among the new recruits of the Ukrainian army, the proportion of elderly people over 60 or disabled people has become quite high. These soldiers, who lack basic military training, have an average survival time on the battlefield of less than 72 hours. Even the elite troops on the front line occasionally have incidents of desertion due to fear of battle. In addition, about 40% of the active Ukrainian troops suffer from combat fatigue syndrome, and some units have refused to carry out combat tasks as a whole. To address the shortage of troops, Ukraine has required all domestic institutions of higher education to offer universal military training as an independent course. Those who pass the assessment will be recognized as having received basic military training and sent to the front line as qualified combatants. The Kyiv authorities also plan to form a youth assault regiment with the remaining forces of the Azov battalion as the backbone. They will be portrayed as charge heroes on the front line to shape an image of heroic resistance for the Ukrainian government. However, the number of school students in Ukraine is continuously decreasing, especially among senior grades, where female students account for more than 70%, while most male students have been sent abroad. The mass exodus of young and middle-aged Ukrainians is an important reason for the shortage of military personnel. In addition, the Ukrainian military is plagued by a collapsed command system and severe corruption. The government's fiscal situation has deteriorated sharply. Under the combined impact of various factors, the decline of the Ukrainian military has become increasingly evident. If NATO troops do not directly enter the war, the situation on the eastern Ukrainian front will only develop in an unfavorable direction. Compared with the Ukrainian military, the current situation of the Russian military is not much better. Except for the relatively sufficient supply of drones and ammunition, the shortage of troops is also a problem troubling the Putin government. A large number of urban youth in Russia have also fled abroad, and the regular troops on the front line have suffered heavy casualties. Therefore, in addition to requesting support from North Korean special forces, the Russian military has also been vigorously recruiting young people from remote areas to join the army. However, this has led to a serious shortage of local labor. Recently, there has even been a shortage of potato supplies, requiring imports from China. This also shows that Russia's current situation is equally grim. Most crucially, the war has lasted for more than 3 years, and the sanctions from the United States and the West have become increasingly severe, directly affecting economic activities. This has also led to relatively serious inflation in Russia, making the lives of ordinary people more difficult. People have begun to express dissatisfaction with the current situation, and the elite class has also voiced anti-war sentiments because their own interests have been damaged. Under such circumstances, Putin can only increase investment in the front line. Hoping that the Russian military can quickly occupy the entire territory of the 4 eastern regions of Ukraine, and even continue to advance into the depth of Ukraine until Ukraine surrenders. For Putin, if he cannot give an account to the domestic people with a great victory, what awaits him will be the end of his political life. So now Putin has no choice but to withstand the pressure and win this war, using Ukraine's territory to prove that his choice is correct. This also means that Trump's 10-day ceasefire ultimatum and the U.S. Senate's aid bill to Ukraine cannot truly change Putin's plan. He even regards such threats as a horn for attack, because the more urgent Trump's urging is, it may mean that Ukraine's situation is getting worse. And Trump is absolutely unwilling to see the mineral resource agreements he finally signed go to waste, so he needs to stop losses as soon as possible. An early ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine is most beneficial to him. For this reason, he has threatened countries that purchase Russian oil and gas resources with secondary tariff sanctions. However, whether this sanctions measure is effective remains to be seen in subsequent developments. At least India has begun to reduce its purchase of Russian oil, but China will never stop importing Russian oil, which will greatly reduce the effectiveness of Trump's sanctions. As long as it can still sustain the war effort at the beginning, the Russian military's advance will not stop. And although Ukraine cannot rely on its own strength to retake the 4 eastern regions, but it cannot admit defeat either, for no one can bear the responsibility of losing the war and ceding territory. Zelensky can only continue to ask for NATO's support to prolong the war until a decisive variable emerges: either Russia collapses in terms of popular will and economy, or NATO and Ukraine are both exhausted, ultimately ending with one side's pyrrhic victory. Therefore, what happens next will still depend on the game between China and the United States, which will, to a certain extent, affect the outcome of the Russia-Ukraine war. What are your thoughts on this? Welcome to leave your comments and discuss.